Roger, if you could unmute there. There you go.
Okay. Good morning. And I read the chapter, and then I was contemplating, well, what does this mean for me? And I'm just drawn to, first of all, some sayings by Nisargadatta. And he said, everything is made out of love. And he said, in that context, he said, this gurgling stream of a world flows out of the love I am. And he said, I am presence, not I am present, or you are present, or she is present, but I am presence itself. When one sees the situation as it really is, that no individual is involved, that what is present is presence as a whole, then the moment this is perceived deeply, there is liberation. So in reflecting on this and going deeper into myself, to contemplate this, it's like it's liberation from all ideas of liberation. And I'm reminded of the spirit of the Bodhisattva path. Bodhisattvas, cultivate the courage, and they learn to cultivate the freedom to explore and welcome the mind that experiences suffering so that all beings may be liberated from suffering. And I'm also drawn to the word courage. It doesn't mean the absence of fear. It means willingness to be present to our fear in the face of fear. And so there's let's see. Yeah, there's a brief interchange Nisargadatta had with one of his students who, and the student asks him, does the inner guru, is he the teacher? And Nisargadatta answers, the teacher grants the conviction that you are the timeless, changeless reality consciousness love within and beyond all appearances. And the student says, well, but a conviction is not enough. There must be certainty. And I was kind of expecting Nisargadatta to say, no, there's no certainty or something along those lines. But instead he goes, quite right. There must be certainty. But in this case, he said, certainty takes the shape of courage. Fear ceases absolutely. The state of fearlessness is so unmistakably new, yet felt deeply as one's own, that it cannot be denied. It is like loving one's own child. Who can doubt it? So Nisargadatta here, he's pretty obviously describing his own experience, which is not my experience. So when I contemplate this, it's like there's an impulse to aspire to that state of fearlessness that he's talking about. And then as soon as I do that, I'm drawn to one of my other teachers, Reb Anderson, saying that confession is a really important part of our practice. Confessing our patterns of self-clinging, our patterns of doubt, our patterns of self-assertion, and our patterns of half-hearted attempts to penetrate this fearlessness that Nisargadatta is talking about. And that can melt the root of our self-clinging. My experience with that is that it's just a relief to say, okay, I'm not fearless. But I wish that all beings could be fearless, and I wish that I was fearless. It is an inspiration to go deeper and be willing to face the idea that maybe suffering can end, you know, maybe there is an end to suffering, to be open to that possibility, that liberation is a real possibility for us. And then part of that, I went from there, what comes up, I was remembering an old song from the 60s that some of you might remember. There was a guy named Donovan who sang this song, and there's a Zen phrase in there. First there are mountains, then there are no mountains, and then there is, you know, kind of, some of you may remember that song over 50 years ago. So us kids were hearing Zen in the late 60s, whether we knew it or not, right? So we do go through that, you know, in Zen. It's first, the mountains are just mountains from our container box of self, you know, our separate self, confined and ignorant self. Mountains are just mountains. Then if we hear the Dharma and we begin to penetrate the spirit of the Heart Sutra a little bit, there are no mountains, so there's no mountains there. And then later on, as we mature as bodhisattvas, the mountains are no longer something separate from us. Of course, this is an ongoing process that I'm certainly still going through. But these mountains are, the third stage of mountains are the liberated mountains. So they're free to boogie in the basement and soar to the heavens in bliss. And they're completely free. They embody the freedom of the life force we really are. And I think we go through those same three stages as individuals. First, we're just this self. We're Roger, we're Tom, Claudette, Frank, and Donna. We're just individuals. Then we realize that we're not this separate self, at least intellectually, we believe that. Begin to believe it on a little bit deeper level. Then we realize that like the 10th stage of the 10 ox herding pictures, we learn to cultivate the freedom to live freely in the world as liberation, the liberated consciousness. So we're free, and the mountains liberation is our liberation. There's no separation. This is the only way I know. When I first was reading Dogen as a young student, when he started talking about the mountains walking, I had no idea. What the hell is he talking about? The mountains walking. This is crazy stuff. I stopped taking LSD because I don't want to. So now that liberation of infinite consciousness is more and more, at least I'm much more open to the possibility that that is our true body, our true identity. One thing that Dan said in here, he was talking on page 226, he says, we are actually all free individuals because we are connected up with everything. And yeah, I think that's true in a way. There is a way you could say that. But what seems more in line, you know, I read the Perfect Brilliant Stillness from David Karst. I finally read the whole thing. He would tend to disagree with that and say, okay, maybe you can use that in a certain context, but he would say, no, actually, we are the freedom to fully live and express the liberation of the ultimate in the form of a person. But, you know, Dan's phrase there is too much of like, it's too much like we're still considering ourselves to be a separate entity that is connected to all things and that is free. So that this idea of being an individual entity needs to be deeply uprooted. We need to melt the root of that more deeply than statements like that. And that may be true, but I'm still reserving judgment on what Dan said, because it could be what he's saying is that he's knowingly making a concession to the viewpoint of the separate self, because that's where his readers are at. In other words, before you tell them the ultimate truth that Karst would say, maybe they need to feel connected, that feel free as individuals before they can deeply enter the teaching, in a more complete way or thorough way. So there's that possibility. And I also thought in reading Karst, where he had a disagreement with Ramesh, I guess Ramesh was a student of Nisargadatta, is that right? Because I don't know much about him, but apparently he was a student of Nisargadatta also, right? Yeah, so maybe he seemed to think that Ramesh actually now believed in a later stage of his life that there is an actual separate self, and that they couldn't really agree on that. So I thought, well, okay, it could be the same thing that's going on, a misunderstanding that Ramesh feels like he needs to make that concession to the separate self, as an expedient for his students. So who knows? So I was listening to a talk that Reb was giving recently, and along those lines, he was saying there are no enlightened beings. There is enlightened activity, and that we are that enlightened activity. I think in the context of what we're talking about, liberation, that enlightened activity and liberated activity, or the liberation of activity, is pretty much the same thing. So we're talking about liberation here, not liberation of a separate body mind of the person, but liberation from the confines of the idea of a person. There's no entity there. But we cultivate the freedom by, opening to that possibility and confessing our shortcomings, our half-heartedness. We open to that possibility that our true identity is the freedom of the ultimate. In fact, that is what we are. The ultimate freedom is what we actually are. So we join that enlightened activity, or we experience joining it, because we haven't ever been separate from it, or ever been not that, but we join it as bodhisattvas to free beings from suffering. And then I wanted to read something that Reb said in his last book here. In chapter 16 of the Lotus Sutra, the Buddha says, "I am always thinking." The Buddha is thinking, "How may I lead all living beings to enter the unexcelled path and quickly to perfect the Buddha body?" That was a reassurance to me to hear, the Buddha is always thinking, because I'm always thinking. So, I don't have to feel guilty about thinking, right? As if I didn't already know that here, but to hear it is reassuring. This discursive thought is always present in Buddha's deep tranquility without disturbing it. So it doesn't disturb his tranquility. Buddhas may think, may all beings be happy, and may all beings quickly enter the Buddha way. But they don't grasp those thoughts. They calmly offer them as gifts. And that's another big teaching of Reb's, is offer all our experience to the Buddhas. That's how we really enter our true self, enter the fullness of being ourself with the capital S. Just offer all of our experience to the Buddhas, and that also melts the root of our feeling of separation from that life force of the Buddha's compassion. Then he goes on, Dogen taught that the thought of bodhicitta is present in the mind of bodhisattvas from its first arising to its final realization in Buddhahood. In this way, there is thinking from the beginning to the end of the path. Mature bodhisattvas are always thinking of their vow, but they do not grasp it. So in a way, this is kind of the heart of the bodhisattva path. And it also gives a little more clarity on the teaching of, sitting in suffering, cultivating the courage to face suffering is not grasping at our experience, and also not turning away from it. So in a way, we cultivate the freedom to sit deeper and deeper into the downtown of suffering, rather than keeping ourselves outside in the suburbs. And this goes back to the Nisargadatta's talking about presence as a whole. It's the all pervasiveness of enlightened or liberated activity. And what I read about Reb, I think, in the Bodhisattva path is also, I think, addresses the issue of, timeless vigilance or eternal vigilance. That's the vigilance of the Bodhisattva. And the deeper we allow ourselves to go, it really touches us in the heart, allowing the heart to break open to the difficulties of the world and to deeply contemplate how can we aid beings on their path to relieving suffering. A deeper opening into the heart of the beating of the universal heart. Last thing I wanted to do, wanted to read a few short poems of Ryokan's, because I spend a lot of time alone now. My youngest kid is going away to college in a month. And so to me, Ryokan really so deeply embodies the spirit of being alone, and being that self of being alone. Maybe in a way what Dan talked about, how we find our innate independence. So, but Ryokan was very lonely, but in the spirit of the Buddha's way and the Bodhisattva path, always thinking of how to liberate beings. So here's one short one of his. Soaring birds disappear over the distant mountains. Leaves fall continually in the quiet garden. Lonely autumn breezes. An old monk in his black robe. I stand alone. And one more. A cold night, sitting alone in my empty room, filled only with incense smoke. Outside a bamboo grove of 100 trees. On the bed, several volumes of poetry. The moon shines through the top of the window, and the entire neighborhood is still except for the cry of insects. Looking at this scene, boundless emotion, but not one word. And actually today is the anniversary of my sister who committed suicide. And I have a brother who also committed suicide 10 years ago. So I had two siblings. And so in terms of death, here's a very deeply heartfelt poem for me from Ryokan. Walking along a narrow path at the foot of a mountain, I come to an ancient cemetery filled with countless tombstones and 1,000-year-old oaks and pines. The day is ending with a lonely, plaintive wind. The names on the tombs are completely faded, and even the relatives have forgotten who they were. Choked with tears, unable to speak, I take my staff and return home. And one last one. What is the heart of this old monk like? A gentle wind beneath the vast sky. So, yeah, I didn't get real into the chapter so much, but it did give cause for. I'm not, this doesn't sound like the subject for the declaration the separate self of the American deeply deluded consciousness, you know. So I respect Dan as a teacher, but I think he was a little off the mark. All right. So whatever else you'd like to talk about, comment.
This chapter was actually great for me, but for the same reason why you didn't like it.
Yeah.
I thought about Thomas Jefferson, and I never thought about American and Zen in the same way as I did. For some reason, I was in the right frame of mind to read this chapter. In America, it's all about individualism, individual freedom, our rights. It's all about me. Don't tread on me. My stuff. I'm separate. You don't have a right to. The government should stay away. Come take my AR-15. I'm not going to take the vaccine. You know, all the, in other words, you use the word uproot our individuality. In America, we're trying to root our individuality almost every single day. The message of our culture is the opposite of Zen. You're laughing about this, Thomas, you know? So to a certain extent, being Zen in America makes you schizophrenic, you know? Just like next week, my thing on consumerism and Zen, oh my God. I'm a Zen guy in America with QVC, you know, and television and Budweiser, you know? And my desire in the morning wake up is to just start consuming. But I want at the same time, I want to sort of you know, be a Zen guy. So I just, in reading this chapter, I did think about the fact that as Americans, we are deeply rooted in this idea of me more than any other culture in the world. I've lived overseas a little bit, and in my time there, my time in Germany, for example, the Germans are like a hive, you know. If your grass is too high, your neighbors will complain if you cut it down, and you don't fight them. Nobody resists anything. The fire department there inspects your house every year, and they say, move these boxes. Your house is cluttered. They'll make you unclutter your house. They'll make you clean your house, your neighbors. In other words, everybody is part of a commune, I imagine. I imagine it's probably that way in Jamaica or Italy or other places too, where it's sort of this community thing. But here in America is my idea of you know, of I do what I want. I put up the Trump and JFK Jr. flag and tell my neighbors to go fuck themselves. You know, I have a sign in my front yard. Your president is an idiot, or I want to carry my AR-15 on my back into McDonald's to get a hamburger. You know, that's the American thing. So it's like we're spectacularly individual. We're probably the most atomized society in the history of the world. Maybe the end of the Roman Empire was like this, maybe, but we are spectacularly atomized, and we're so different than other cultures who have some sort of ethos where they, you know, where when you go there, you sort of feel the community. Now, the good news for me is I'm in rural West Virginia, where there's a lot of you know, family stuff and company stuff, but there's still this deep-rooted individuality that keeps us all different. And I think that what we want to do is, I didn't quite think about it for this chapter 2, is the Declaration of Independence is the wrong message for Zen, and so is the Constitution. And by focusing on the importance of the individual and the freedom of an individual to be free as an individual is a misunderstanding about what's the expression for everything rising together? What's called? Everybody connected together.
Indra's net.
What?
Indra's net.
There's a Zen expression too. So about the things that the
12-fold chain of causation.
Yeah, so it's something like that. Yeah, so that it's all together. And I've always been a hard determinist myself. I've in my study of Zen, I've come to the conclusion that everything in my life has been, you know, I speak typically myself. And Fox News is typically itself. The Yankees are typically themselves. Thoreau did Thoreau talk, you know. Thomas Jefferson did Thomas Jefferson talk. It's like a bunch of stuff just sort of running on empty, thoughtlessly, manufacture yourself. Then occasionally in silence you sit and you sort of get connected to everything, you know. I like the thing about the insects and the moon. No, there are no words, you know. That's correct. You know, it's just sit in my garden and try and do it. You know, today I'm going to go. We're building a Habitat for Humanity house down the street from me, and our big project here. When I'm done with this, I'm put on some old clothes and go paint Habitat for Humanity house. And I'm going to just do manual labor for a couple hours with other human beings. I'm not going to exercise my freedom and my rights, you know. So Thomas Jefferson was mad, and so was Hamilton, and so was these guys. You know, these motherfuckers were slave owners. They didn't know dinosaurs existed, and if they saw an electric light bulb, they think it was witchcraft. You know, why whatever they say do you have to follow? What's so magical about them? You know.
Yeah.
If Thomas Jefferson walked in here today, I could like amaze and shock. I don't burn my lighter. I flick. He probably get down on his knees, start praying to me. That's the guy we follow. You know. Yeah. I showed my plasma TV in 3D with surround sound, and I say, "Hey, Tom, you're so smart. What do you think about this?"
Yeah. You know, when I was reading the chapter, I reflected on you mentioned Alexander Hamilton, and I thought, what would the bodhisattvas in the astral world? I hope they were watching or whatever when Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr shot at each other in a duel. I think Hamilton was killed, right?
He was, yeah, in New Jersey.
Compassion is deep enough that it would even be extended to that scene, but to use them as an example of something good, I don't think so.
Right.
You know?
You know, one last thing I just want to find five is this Saturday Night Live did a skit which I'll send you, was pretty embarrassing. Robert De Niro plays Thomas Jefferson, and one of the black actors in the Saturday Night Live is playing his black slave he's having sex with. So he's trying to woo her as this slave. As embarrassing as it was, it really shows. I mean, do you know how bad the founding fathers were? Do you know what the views was toward the Native Americans? Oh my God.
Yeah.
And by the way, here's why we can consume today. Because the land was free and the labor that built it was free. A good deal for us. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. You know, I'm sometimes I'm ashamed to look in the mirror. I say, man, wow. At the same time, that's the human thing. All of our ancestors have done the same thing. Whether it's the tribes of Africa or on the plains of Mongolia or the ancient China, or maybe Lucy and her ancestors coming down from the tree in Tanzania, 100,000 years ago. They pick up a rock and smash somebody else in the head. And it's our opportunity here to say, we're all connected. It's all one thing. And let's try to be peaceful and loving to each other as best we can. Well, I went on too long today. Wow. Okay. Did I want to go on long? No. Jamaica.
Okay.
Roger, thank you for your talk today, and thank you for your courage of trying to be able to understand all that and to experience and to do it and to embody it with it. One of my first memories of being at Southern Palm, I'd been in some Thich Nhat Hanh groups before that, but one of my first memories of was feeling some fear and some anxiety, and the anxiety that I was fearing, like, I started thinking about the potential for what we were saying, and the potential for the words. If I were to truly embody and embrace these words, it would threaten the foundation of everything that I was ever about, and that I would sell everything, and go live in a Zen monastery, for the rest of my life in some way. That I would tune in, and drop out. Turn on, tune in, and drop out with that. And I think that's a constant part of what happens with that. By the way, Donovan did practice Buddhism. So he's a kindred spirit. I think he still may be, actually. I was reading an article about him a couple months ago with that. Still does some touring with that. But anyway, I think, for me, anytime we break the silence, we venture into the territory of delusion. Anytime we break the silence, anytime we think, anytime we start talking, especially when we start talking, I think we break the silence, and I think we break the separation But even that's a delusion in itself, right? I mean, just the fact that we come up with these notions of how we think, it's like we characterize how we think. We come up with a story for these thoughts that we put together, and we put together a chain of evidence. We're constantly, to me, I was thinking that it's almost like a form of enslavement with that, because we can never be fully aware, right? I mean, it's the small I, but it's the I think that Nisargadatta was moving towards. And I wonder if Ramesh isn't doing that when he starts to talk about the self. He's talking about a self that is aware of the something more, but also something less, at the
Aware
same
of being
time.
aware. Yeah.
Aware of being aware.
Yeah.
And I think that constant awareness of being aware, I don't think it's solipsism, and I don't think it's necessary lack of action, but I think it's being able to that vigilance. I think that you talk about is how does one always maintain an awareness of awareness and an awareness of what's happening within experience with that, because I think there's great beauty in Ryokan's poetry, and there's great beauty, and it's like it's that he's capturing the awareness, right? He's capturing the moment. He's capturing the sound of those bamboo trees, in the wind, right? I mean, it's really it's living, and I think to me that's the beauty of poetry and art and music and relationships. There's something about that intimacy, and when you think about the intimacy of, and when you think about your most intimate moments that you've ever experienced with that, there is a blending, that occurs within intimacy where there's Karst talks about it in the book in terms of a scene when he's riding in a taxi through Bombay, I guess it was, and he's riding through, and there's a fellow who's got a disability, and he's begging, and he's got a chant almost in terms of his begging, but there's a moment where this armless fellow leans into the car, and they meet eyes, and there's all language goes away, all thought goes away, but it's looking in the eyes. I've had it with, obviously, with my wife. I've had it with close friends. I've had with people who are dying when I used to do that type of work. There's that moment where there's no need for anything. It's just that communication. It's not necessarily seen, and it's not necessarily hear, and it's not necessarily touch. I think it comes through different senses, but there is a connection, I think, to the I that I think is inevitable or impossible. And I seek that because I worry about what that means to do that, because but my worry is a delusion too, right? And my assumption that it's that awareness of awareness of awareness of awareness, this moment, all the things we've worked on so hard, I think, within the Zen world with that. But thank you for your talk. I appreciate your courage.
Yeah, I remember that part of the book where he's talking about the taxi ride in Bombay. And what came up for me is that in the fullness of the spirit, all playing fields are leveled, There's a oneness there, that it doesn't matter who you are at all, one iota on the outside. It's the meeting of the spirit right there. Yeah. The depth of that. You can't manufacture it. It just happens. It's all spontaneous.
Thank you. Thank you, Roger, for your talk. At first, I was wondering if I missed the chapter again, if we had read the same chapter, but I do get it. The chapter talked about the connection of us all, and what came out to me, because one of the things I've been struggling with for the a couple of years now is the whole idea of this social, the injustices, systemic racism and all of that. And one of the things that came out to me in the chapter was that, we're all connected. And so if one being is suffering, we're all suffering. And how do I really examine my suffering? Because sometimes it's so easy for me to not be connected with it and feel like I'm over here and that's over there. And how do we really, how do we save ourselves and as a result, save all beings? And especially as it relates to injustices and inequities, how do we do that? That's a big question. And I guess a big part of it is not knowing how to answer that question, and sometimes just sitting with it and being with it. But also not being afraid of acknowledging that it does exist and that this is a reality, especially in America, where there's such disparity. Is, I think, what's our role as bodhisattvas to acknowledge that this is present and real.
Yeah.
So yes, we're all connected and we're all suffering as a result. So
yeah, thank you. It seems like I mentioned that the teaching of don't grasp and don't turn away. And then also how the bodhisattvas make all their thinking about their path and their deep wish to save all beings from suffering. How that process somehow draws us, if we kind of have to enter that practice of not grasping, not turning away, we kind of have to enter it on faith in some way. But there's something from inside, the aliveness inside, that feels like it's drawing us to that spirit, to that deep aspiration for Buddhahood. I can't put it into words any better than that, maybe, but it's like surrendering, like I think it was Maharshi who said, Ramana Maharshi said, surrender itself is a deep prayer. In the spirit of Rumi and in the spirit of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara in Buddha too.
Well, I thought the thing that stood out for me is on page 229. Jefferson's powerful writings include prescient, currently relevant utterances such as, if there be one principle more deeply rooted than any other in the mind of every American, it is that we should have nothing to do with conquest. And I think if you think about that, that is not only a personal statement talking about the ego, but about what we do as a country. And of course, you find examples of conquest all over the place. The other statement, and I think this is great, I hope we crush in its birth the aristocracy of our moneyed corporations, which dare already to challenge our government to a trial by strength and bid defiance to the laws of our country. I think that's a powerful statement, and that was going on at the founding of the country, and now it reaches pinnacle with lobbyists controlling everything. I think you have to be vigilant on all fronts. I think you have to be vigilant on yourselves and what you do so you don't overpower others and, you know, the thing about conquest. But I think we really have to look at what's going on in our government right now. And I mean, I just was appalled and still am appalled and scared about the next elections coming up. And the fact, I mean, a friend of mine alerted me, and this is off the subject, because I haven't been paying attention to the news. I just don't want to hear it. That Trump's ex-wife died, and I read she was the cause of death was blows to the torso with a blunt instrument, but that it was accidental. She was hitting herself. I mean, an accident. I'm really wondering what's going on in this country. So my vigilance is there. I think what's going on, going back to the Kennedy assassination, there's a whole thing I have on that. I think that there's a lot going on in this country that we don't know about, and that's very dangerous. And Leighton seems to be political because he brings up Bob Dylan. He quotes different contemporary people. So part of what we're doing, liberation, is also liberating the whole, the environment, each other, and we have to be vigilant to do that. Thank you.